There is an idea that has spread far too quickly in recent years. The idea that spiritual awakening means the end of suffering. That once you wake up, the ego dissolves, life becomes lighter, and peace becomes permanent. It sounds beautiful, comforting, almost irresistible. But something doesn't add up. If awakening truly worked this way, why are so many people who consider themselves awake still anxious, irritated, lost, or emotionally stuck? Carl Jung noticed this contradiction very early on, and he didn't ignore it. Jung understood that the spiritual path, when misunderstood, can become one of the most sophisticated forms of self-deception. Instead of freeing us, it can strengthen the ego. Instead of healing, it can push unresolved conflicts deeper into the unconscious. Instead of reducing suffering, it can make it subtler, more confusing, and harder to confront. And perhaps most unsettling of all, many spiritual traditions, when read superficially, can unintentionally feed this very mistake. This is where Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism enter the conversation, not as quick promises of salvation, but as deep psychological maps of the human mind. Jung did not look at these traditions as belief systems to be followed blindly. He approached them as symbolic descriptions of the psyche, of consciousness struggling with itself. Through them, he saw powerful explanations not only for why we suffer, but for how suffering can actually increase when awakening is pursued in the wrong way. Maybe the problem isn't spirituality itself, maybe it's how we use it. Maybe suffering doesn't disappear with enlightenment, it simply changes location. And maybe what we call awakening hides a shadow that very few people are willing to face. That shadow, and what Jung saw within it, is what this journey is about. Before we go further, if this reflection has unsettled you even slightly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, not for comfort, but for clarity. When we talk about the ego today, many people immediately label it as something bad, something to be destroyed or transcended as quickly as possible. But the real problem is not having an ego at all. The problem is being unconsciously ruled by it. The modern mind lives under constant stimulation, comparison, and pressure to perform, and slowly the ego begins to inflate, stretching itself thin while pretending to be strong. When it starts to wobble, suffering appears, disguised as anxiety, exhaustion, or a vague sense that something inside no longer fits. What makes this especially difficult is that the modern ego rarely sees itself clearly. It mistakes speed for direction and intensity for meaning. Being busy feels like being alive, being visible feels like being real, and being admired feels like being whole. Jung would say this is not confidence but compensation, a fragile identity trying to hold itself together through external reinforcement. And the more the ego depends on recognition, the more terrified it becomes of losing it, which quietly keeps the psyche in a permanent state of tension. This is why so much modern suffering feels restless rather than dramatic. It is not always a clear crisis, but a low-level pressure that never fully turns off. People feel uneasy when they are alone, uncomfortable in silence, and anxious when nothing is happening. From Jung's perspective, this is the unconscious pushing back, signaling that identity has become too narrow. The ego has taken the center of the stage, and everything else, instinct, emotion, intuition, shadow, has been pushed into the background. You can see this clearly in moments of friction. A small criticism lands harder than it should. A disagreement feels like a personal attack. A minor failure triggers disproportionate self-doubt. In those moments, the reaction is not really about the situation. It is about identity being threatened. The ego feels exposed, and the psyche responds defensively. Jung believed these reactions are not weaknesses but clues, pointing directly to where consciousness has become too rigid. If this rigidity continues unchecked, suffering doesn't explode, it accumulates. The person may function, succeed, and even appear confident, yet feel internally disconnected. This is often the moment when spirituality enters the picture, promising relief from ego-driven pain. But without understanding how deeply the ego is involved in suffering, that promise becomes dangerous. Because what the ego fears most is not pain, It is losing control, and that fear sets the stage for the next layer of the journey. For Jung, religions were never primarily about belief. He did not approach them as systems demanding faith, obedience, or moral alignment. He approached them as symbolic maps of the psyche, developed over centuries as humanity tried to understand its own inner life. Where most people ask whether a religious idea is true or false, Jung asked something far more revealing. Does it transform consciousness, or does it merely organize belief? This distinction changes everything. Truth, in the psychological sense, is not something that convinces the intellect alone. It is something that rearranges perception. Jung understood that the unconscious does not speak the language of logic. It speaks in images, myths, paradoxes, and stories that bypass rational defenses. This is why ancient symbols continue to move people long after their original cultural context has faded. They touch something structural in the mind, something that existed long before modern explanations. What Jung found striking was that people often reduce religions to surface-level interpretations, missing their psychological depth entirely. When myths are treated literally, they lose their power. When they are dismissed as superstition, they are ignored altogether. But when they are approached symbolically, they reveal patterns of fear, desire, conflict, and integration that still shape modern lives. In this sense, religion becomes less about doctrine and more about orientation, a way of understanding where consciousness is stuck and how it might move. This is also why Jung was wary of blind belief, whether religious or secular. Any system that provides answers without demanding inner work becomes a substitute for awareness. The ego is relieved from questioning itself, and the unconscious is left unheard. From Jung's perspective, the danger is not believing too much, but believing in a way that prevents psychological growth. Symbols are meant to be engaged with, not obeyed or discarded. Once this symbolic lens is adopted, a subtle but unsettling realization emerges. Much of what people call suffering is not imposed from the outside. It is generated internally, through rigid identification and unconscious attachment. Religion, when misunderstood, can reinforce that rigidity. When understood symbolically, it can expose it. And that realization leads directly to a deeper question. If suffering is so tightly bound to identity, what exactly is the ego doing at the center of our inner life? As Jung continued to observe the human psyche, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Much of what people experience as suffering does not originate in events themselves, but in the ego's insistence on standing at the center of everything. The ego wants coherence, control, and continuity. It wants life to follow a narrative it can recognize and manage. When reality cooperates, things feel stable. When it doesn't, the psyche tightens and suffering emerges almost immediately. What makes this dynamic so persistent is that the ego rarely presents itself as a problem. It frames its demands as reasonable, the need to be respected, the desire to feel secure, the expectation that effort should lead to predictable outcomes. On the surface, none of this seems pathological, but Jung noticed that when identity becomes fused with these expectations, every disruption feels personal. A disagreement becomes rejection, a setback becomes failure. The ego does not simply experience events, it interprets them as verdicts about its own worth. This is why suffering so often escalates far beyond the situation that triggered it. A relationship ending hurts, of course, but the deeper pain often comes from the collapse of an imagined future. The ego grieves not only what was lost, but what it assumed would exist. In Jungian terms, the unconscious reacts to this rupture by flooding consciousness with emotion, trying to force awareness of how tightly identity had been bound to an illusion of permanence. Over time, the ego's need to maintain its central position turns into a quiet source of chronic tension. Life becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. Every choice carries the pressure of self-definition. Every mistake threatens identity, and every moment of uncertainty feels unsafe. From Jung's perspective, this is not a moral failure, but a structural one. Consciousness has narrowed too much, leaving no room for contradiction, ambiguity, or change. The crucial shift begins when the ego is no longer treated as the author of meaning, but as one participant within a much larger psychic system. This does not eliminate suffering overnight, but it changes its role. Pain becomes informative rather than purely destructive. It starts pointing toward where identity has hardened and where consciousness needs to expand. And once that possibility is glimpsed, the question naturally arises: how do traditions like Buddhism approach this problem of ego and suffering without simply replacing one illusion with another? When Jung turned his attention to Buddhism, he did not see it as a religion built around belief or worship. What he recognized instead was a disciplined and almost surgical investigation of the mind. Buddhism begins not with promises of happiness, but with a sober observation. Suffering exists, and it is intimately tied to the way consciousness clings to identity. For Jung, this made Buddhism less a faith system and more a psychological method, one that takes the ego seriously enough to question it. The Buddhist idea of non-self often creates immediate resistance, especially in Western minds. It can sound like a denial of individuality or a threat to personal meaning. Jung, however, interpreted it differently. He saw non-self not as annihilation, but as disidentification. Thoughts, emotions, roles, and narratives continue to arise, but they are no longer mistaken for the totality of who one is. In this shift, the ego is not destroyed, it is dethroned. And when the ego loses its absolute authority, suffering begins to loosen its grip. What fascinated Jung was how this process mirrors what happens in deep psychological work. When a person learns to observe inner states without immediately acting on them, something subtle changes. Anxiety no longer defines the self. Fear becomes an experience rather than an identity. The unconscious, instead of erupting through symptoms, starts to communicate more gently. In this sense, Buddhist practices resemble a long-term training in psychological containment, the capacity to hold inner tension without collapsing into reaction. But Jung was also careful here. He noticed that the language of emptiness and detachment can easily be misunderstood, especially by those already inclined to escape from life's demands. When the ego hears nothingness, it may interpret it as permission to withdraw, disengage, or bypass responsibility. What appears outwardly calm can hide inner stagnation. From a Jungian perspective, this is not liberation, but repression wearing spiritual clothing. This tension is crucial. Buddhism offers a profound way of loosening identification, but it does not automatically guarantee integration. If awareness expands while unresolved conflicts remain untouched, the psyche becomes divided rather than whole. Jung believed true transformation requires not only stepping back from the ego, but also returning to life with greater clarity. And that raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. At what point does emptiness free the mind, and at what point does it become a subtle form of avoidance? The idea of illumination is often presented as a final destination, a state of permanent peace where inner conflict dissolves and suffering no longer touches the self. Jung approached this promise with caution. He noticed that when illumination is imagined as an escape from tension rather than a transformation of consciousness, it becomes psychologically dangerous. The ego, which once chased success or approval, simply adopts a new goal: spiritual purity. The pursuit changes costume, but the structure remains the same. Emptiness, in this context, becomes ambiguous. At its best, it loosens the grip of rigid identification and creates space for awareness. At its worst, it turns into anesthesia, a quieting of discomfort without understanding it. Jung observed that people can learn to suppress emotional turbulence through spiritual language while leaving the underlying conflicts untouched. Calm appears on the surface, but vitality diminishes underneath. The psyche grows quieter, not clearer. This is where spiritual escape begins to take shape. Responsibilities are reframed as attachments, difficult emotions are dismissed as illusions, and unresolved relational patterns are labeled as egoic distractions. The individual feels lighter, yet strangely less engaged with life. From a Jungian standpoint, this is not transcendence but avoidance, a narrowing of experience disguised as expansion. The unconscious, deprived of expression, eventually reasserts itself through apathy, depression, or sudden disorientation. Jung believed genuine illumination must increase psychological capacity, not reduce it. It should widen one's tolerance for ambiguity, contradiction, and emotional complexity. If spiritual practice leads to withdrawal from relationship, creativity, or ethical responsibility, something essential has been lost. Emptiness, when authentic, makes room for life. When misused, it creates distance from it. This distinction matters because the ego is remarkably adaptable. When confronted directly, it resists. When offered a spiritual ideal, it imitates. The danger is not that the ego survives awakening, but that it hides within it. And once that happens, suffering does not disappear. It becomes harder to recognize, setting the stage for a subtler and more refined imbalance that demands another kind of wisdom altogether. When Jung encountered Taoism, he sensed a shift in emphasis. Where Buddhism often focuses on loosening identification, Taoism speaks the language of balance. Not balance as an ideal to be achieved, but as a dynamic process that unfolds when the psyche stops forcing itself in one direction. The Tao is not a goal nor a doctrine to be mastered. It is a description of how life organizes itself when interference diminishes. For Jung, this resonated deeply with the way the psyche seeks equilibrium when the ego relaxes its grip. What Taoism seems to understand intuitively is that psychological suffering often arises not from chaos, but from excessive control. The ego tries to impose order prematurely, cutting off natural rhythms of tension and release. In response, the psyche stiffens, anxiety increases, spontaneity fades, and life feels heavy. Taoist thought does not argue against structure, but against rigidity. It suggests that harmony emerges not when opposites are eliminated, but when they are allowed to move freely. The principle of Wu Wei is often misunderstood as passivity, but Jung recognized it as something far more subtle. It describes action without inner violence, movement that is not driven by fear, compulsion, or the need to prove something. Psychologically, this resembles a state where consciousness cooperates with unconscious processes instead of constantly overruling them. Decisions arise with less friction, not because life becomes easy, but because resistance softens. In everyday experience, this difference is palpable. There are moments when effort feels productive and aligned, and others when the same effort feels strained and draining. Taoism invites awareness of this distinction. Jung would say this sensitivity reflects a more mature relationship between ego and unconscious das, where the ego listens before it acts. The psyche no longer needs to rebel through symptoms because it is being acknowledged. This Taoist lens reveals a different way of relating to inner conflict. Instead of asking how to eliminate tension, it asks how to hold it without distortion. Balance is not static, it is constantly negotiated. And when this negotiation becomes conscious, a deeper pattern emerges, one where opposing forces are not enemies, but partners in a larger movement of integration. That realization naturally opens the door to the symbolic language of yin and yang, where polarity itself becomes a guide rather than a problem. When Jung reflected on the symbol of yin and yang, he did not see a mystical diagram meant to decorate philosophy books. He saw a precise psychological insight. The mind is not built around absolutes, but around tension between opposites. Consciousness moves by oscillation, expansion and contraction, action and rest, clarity and confusion. None of these states are meant to dominate permanently. Suffering begins when the ego tries to freeze this movement and identify with only one side of the equation. In psychological terms, yin and yang describe complementary functions within the psyche. Rational clarity without emotional depth becomes dry and disconnected. Sensitivity without structure dissolves into indecision. Jung noticed that many neuroses form precisely at the point where one pole is overdeveloped and the other is neglected. The unconscious responds by compensating, often in disruptive ways. What is ignored internally returns as anxiety, obsession, or chronic dissatisfaction. This dynamic is especially visible in modern life. Productivity, speed, and efficiency are rewarded, while receptivity, reflection, and stillness are treated as weaknesses. The psyche adapts outwardly, but inwardly it becomes unbalanced. Jung would say the shadow grows precisely where one side of the personality is denied expression. Yin does not disappear when Yang dominates. It waits, accumulating pressure until it finds a way to re-enter consciousness. The integration Jung spoke of is not about choosing the correct side, but about restoring dialogue between them. A person who learns to slow down without collapsing, to act without forcing, begins to experience a different quality of inner stability. This stability is not rigid, it is responsive. The psyche becomes more resilient because it no longer relies on a single mode of being. When this balance starts to take root, identity itself becomes less brittle. The ego no longer needs to defend a fixed position at all costs. Opposites can coexist without threatening the sense of self. And once the mind becomes capable of holding polarity without fragmentation, it naturally reaches for a deeper principle, not just balance, but wholeness. This is where Jung's interest begins to converge with Hindu thought, which pushes the question beyond opposition and into the realm of totality. When Jung encountered Hindu philosophy, he sensed a shift from balance towards something even more expansive. Where Taoism speaks of harmony between forces, Hinduism points to totality, the idea that the psyche is not merely a system of opposing elements, but an expression of a deeper, unifying center. This perspective unsettles the ego because it reframes identity itself. The self is no longer defined by roles, achievements, or inner states, but by something that precedes and contains them all. From a Jungian standpoint, this resonates with the concept of the self as the organizing principle of the psyche. The ego experiences itself as central, but Hindu thought suggests that this centrality is provisional. Suffering arises when the ego mistakes itself for the whole. When identity collapses under pressure, through loss, failure, or transition, the psyche is forced to confront what remains when familiar definitions fall away. Hindu philosophy does not see this collapse as pathological, but as an opening toward a more inclusive sense of being. This idea can feel abstract until it touches lived experience. Consider moments when life strips away a role that once felt essential, a career, a relationship, a social identity. The initial response is often fear or disorientation, as if something vital has been lost. Yet beneath that fear, there is sometimes a quieter realization. Awareness itself remains intact. Jung would say, this is the psyche intuiting a deeper ground, one that does not depend on external form to exist. However, Jung also recognized the psychological risk embedded in this vision of totality. When misunderstood, it can lead to premature inflation, the ego appropriating the language of wholeness without undergoing the work of integration. Saying all is one does not dissolve fragmentation, it can conceal it. True totality, in Jung's view, is not a conclusion but a lived tension, one that holds individuality and universality together without erasing either. And this tension leads directly into one of the most delicate parallels Jung ever explored, the relationship between Atman, Brahman, and the self. As Jung went deeper into Hindu thought, he encountered one of its most radical and psychologically charged ideas, the unity of Atman and Brahman. At a symbolic level, this suggests that what we experience as our deepest inner essence is not separate from the totality of existence. Jung did not approach this as a metaphysical claim to be believed, but as a powerful image of psychic wholeness. In his language, it points toward the self, not the ego, but the deeper center around which the psyche organizes itself. What fascinated Jung was how easily this idea could illuminate or distort consciousness. When approached carefully, it relativizes the ego without annihilating it. The individual no longer experiences themselves as isolated, yet they remain grounded in personal responsibility and limitation. But when the idea is absorbed too quickly, it produces the opposite effect, inflation. The ego identifies with totality instead of relating to it. I am everything becomes a psychological shortcut, bypassing the slow, difficult work of integration. This is where Jung drew a sharp distinction. Encountering the self is not the same as becoming the self. The experience of unity, however profound, does not erase unconscious material, nor does it dissolve shadow. If anything, it intensifies what has been neglected. The psyche demands balance, not transcendence without structure. Jung observed that individuals who prematurely identified with wholeness often became less tolerant, more defensive, and subtly disconnected from others, signs that the ego had expanded, not matured. In lived experience, this dynamic often reveals itself through reactions to limitation. How does a person respond when they are contradicted, ignored, or reduced to something ordinary? If the sense of self collapses or hardens in those moments, the supposed realization of unity has not been integrated. Jung believed humility was not a moral virtue here, but a psychological indicator, a sign that the ego had not confused itself with the center. When Atman and Brahman are held symbolically rather than literally, they offer something far more useful than certainty. They invite the ego into relationship with something larger than itself, without claiming ownership over it. This relationship stabilizes identity rather than dissolving it. And once this distinction becomes clear, attention naturally turns to the images through which these forces appear. The gods, archetypes, and symbolic figures that give psychic energy a recognizable form. Thus, when Jung looked at the gods of Hindu tradition, he did not see distant beings ruling the universe from another realm. He saw living images of psychic forces, patterns of energy that shape human experience from within: creation, preservation, destruction, transformation. These were not external events imposed by divine will, but movements constantly unfolding inside the psyche. The gods gave these movements form, making the invisible dynamics of the inner world visible and relatable. This symbolic reading changes the role of mythology entirely. Instead of asking whether these figures exist, Jung asked what psychological realities they express. Shiva, for example, does not merely represent destruction in a cosmic sense, but the inner necessity of ending what has outlived its function. Vishnu embodies the stabilizing force that maintains coherence when life threatens to fragment. These images arise because the psyche needs a language to engage forces too complex to grasp directly. Without symbols, those forces operate blindly. Modern minds often resist this way of thinking, dismissing mythological images as primitive or irrelevant. Yet Jung noticed that when symbolic language disappears, it does not leave a vacuum. It leaves confusion. The psyche still contains these forces, but without representation they erupt as mood swings, compulsions, or destructive patterns. What is not symbolized tends to be acted out. In this sense, gods do not lose power when they are forgotten. They lose form, and that makes them more dangerous. In everyday life, these archetypal forces can be felt during periods of transition. A person may sense an urge to radically change direction, to let something fall apart, even when the conscious mind resists. Others feel an equally strong pull to preserve stability, to hold on when everything seems uncertain. Jung would say, neither impulse is inherently right or wrong. Psychological suffering emerges when one force is denied expression and the other is allowed to dominate unchecked. Learning to recognize these inner movements symbolically creates space for conscious participation. Instead of being overwhelmed by impulses they do not understand, individuals can begin to relate to them. This does not mean indulging every urge, but acknowledging its presence and meaning. When inner forces are given names and images, they become negotiable rather than absolute. And once this symbolic relationship is established, another pattern becomes visible, one that appears across cultures as a spontaneous image of order itself, the mandala. When Jung began studying mandalas, he realized he was not looking at decorative patterns or religious artifacts, but at spontaneous expressions of psychological order. Mandalas appeared again and again in different cultures, historical periods, and even in the drawings of modern individuals with no exposure to Eastern traditions. This repetition mattered. It suggested that the psyche, when under pressure or in transition, instinctively generates images of wholeness to stabilize itself. What struck Jung most was when mandalas emerged without conscious intention. Patients would draw circular forms during moments of emotional upheaval, confusion, or inner reorganization. These images were not learned, they surfaced. From a psychological perspective, the mandala represents the psyche attempting to reorganize itself around a center, when the ego can no longer maintain coherence on its own. It is not the ego creating order, but something deeper asserting itself. This process explains why symbols often precede understanding. A person may feel fragmented long before they can articulate why. The unconscious responds not with explanations, but with images that gesture toward integration. Jung believed these symbols function as bridges between conscious awareness and deeper psychic layers. They communicate stability without demanding interpretation. Meaning unfolds slowly, through reflection and lived experience, rather than immediate insight. In modern life, symbolic language has been largely replaced by conceptual thinking. We explain, analyze, and label, but rarely allow images to work on us. Jung warned that this over-reliance on intellect weakens the psyche's natural balancing mechanisms. When symbols are ignored, the mind loses one of its most ancient tools for self-regulation. Suffering then becomes harder to process because it has no container. Mandalas remind us that order is not imposed from the outside. It emerges when consciousness relaxes enough to allow deeper patterns to surface. This emergence does not eliminate conflict, but it gives it structure. And once the psyche begins to orient itself toward wholeness, another inevitable encounter follows, not with harmony, but with everything that had been excluded along the way. This encounter has a name in Jung's work, and it marks a turning point in any inner journey: the confrontation with the shadow. At a certain point in any serious inner journey, an uncomfortable realization emerges. Not everything within us wants clarity, harmony, or growth. Jung called this the shadow, the parts of the psyche that the ego has rejected, ignored, or deemed unacceptable. These elements do not disappear simply because consciousness turns toward light or spirituality. In fact, the more forcefully the ego identifies with being evolved, the more energy the shadow tends to accumulate outside awareness. What makes the shadow especially dangerous on the spiritual path is how easily it hides behind good intentions. Qualities like aggression, envy, fear, or the need for control may be denied in the name of peace or compassion, yet continue to operate indirectly. Jung observed that when the shadow is not consciously integrated, it does not weaken, it becomes autonomous. It begins to act through moral rigidity, emotional blind spots, or sudden reactions that seem out of character. The individual believes they are acting from principle, while the shadow pulls the strings from behind the scenes. This is why Jung was skeptical of any spirituality that emphasized purity without confrontation. Avoiding the shadow does not create goodness, it creates fragility. A person who has never faced their own capacity for destructiveness cannot relate maturely to it in others. The shadow, when denied, is projected outward. Enemies multiply, judgment intensifies, and the world becomes divided into the enlightened and the unconscious. Suffering increases, not because the world is darker, but because inner darkness has been externalized. Integration of the shadow does not mean indulging destructive impulses. It means recognizing them as part of the psychic totality and taking responsibility for them. When the ego admits its own limitations and contradictions, something paradoxical happens. Ethical capacity grows. Jung believed true moral strength emerges not from innocence, but from awareness. A person who knows what they are capable of is less likely to act blindly. On the spiritual path, this confrontation marks a decisive turning point. Practices, beliefs, and ideals either deepen into psychological honesty or harden into defenses. The shadow demands engagement, not rejection. And once it begins to be integrated, a subtler problem appears, one that often feels like progress, but is actually another disguise of the ego. This is where Jung identified the rise of the spiritual ego, a refinement of identity that appears enlightened while remaining fundamentally defensive. Once the shadow begins to surface, the ego often adapts in a subtle and convincing way. Jung noticed that instead of resisting spirituality outright, the ego can appropriate it. This is where the spiritual ego is born, not loud or crude, but refined, articulate, and seemingly harmless. It speaks the language of awareness, compassion, and awakening, while quietly using these ideas to protect itself from vulnerability. What looks like growth on the surface can, in reality, be a reorganization of defenses. The spiritual ego differs from ordinary ego not in structure, but in style. It no longer seeks validation through status or achievement, but through perceived depth and insight. The individual feels beyond certain emotions, above certain conflicts, and immune to ordinary psychological struggles. Jung warned that this posture is especially dangerous because it resists correction. Any challenge can be dismissed as unconsciousness in others, while self-examination is subtly avoided. This form of self-deception often reveals itself in rigidity rather than openness. Dialogue becomes difficult, not because the person is aggressive, but because they are certain. Ambiguity feels threatening. Doubt is framed as ignorance. The psyche appears calm, yet lacks permeability. From Jung's perspective, this is a sign that consciousness has stopped developing. The ego has stabilized itself inside an identity that feels elevated, but is no longer flexible. Over time, the unconscious responds to this stagnation. Emotional vitality fades, relationships feel distant, and creativity diminishes. The individual may feel strangely disconnected despite years of practice or study. Jung saw these symptoms as signals that the ego has mistaken a spiritual posture for integration. True transformation increases depth, responsiveness, and humility. When those qualities shrink, something essential has been lost. The danger of the spiritual ego is not that it seeks meaning, but that it confuses meaning with immunity. Suffering is not abolished, it is rationalized. Conflict is not resolved, and it is bypassed. And because the ego now wears spiritual language, these patterns become harder to detect. Recognizing this is not a reason to abandon spirituality, but to mature it. And that maturation leads directly into one of Jung's most important distinctions: the difference between spiritual illumination and psychological individuation. At this point, Jung's path and the language of Eastern spirituality begin to converge, and then quietly diverge. Illumination is often described as a state of awakening that transcends the ego, dissolving identification and revealing a deeper reality. Individuation, however, follows a different logic. For Jung, the goal was not to rise above the personality, but to bring it into conscious relationship with the total psyche. Individuation is not about leaving the human behind. It is about becoming fully human. Jung noticed that many Western seekers were drawn to the idea of illumination precisely because it promised relief from inner conflict. The notion of transcendence can feel seductive when personal history, emotional wounds, or unresolved patterns remain painful. But Jung warned that attempting to dissolve the ego before it has been adequately formed is like dismantling a structure that was never stable to begin with. What appears as awakening may actually be fragmentation, a loss of orientation disguised as freedom. Individuation demands something less dramatic and far more demanding. It requires sustained engagement with one's own contradictions, limitations, and unconscious material. Instead of escaping tension, the individual learns to carry it. Instead of identifying with ideals, they confront lived reality. Jung believed this process unfolds within ordinary life, through work, relationships, failure, responsibility, and choice. There is no separate realm where individuation occurs. It happens precisely where the ego would prefer not to look. This distinction reframes suffering entirely. From an individuation perspective, pain is not an obstacle to awakening, but a signal of unfinished integration. Psychological tension points toward growth rather than error. Illumination seeks resolution by stepping beyond. Individuation seeks depth by stepping into. The former can be sudden and destabilizing, the latter slow and consolidating. Jung did not deny the value of transcendent experience, but he insisted it must return to the personality if it is to be transformative. When this return does not happen, illumination remains abstract. The individual may feel expanded in moments, yet unchanged in patterns. Individuation, by contrast, leaves traces. It alters how one listens, how one reacts, how one bears responsibility. And once this difference becomes clear, another question inevitably arises. If Jung respected Eastern traditions so deeply, where exactly did he draw the line? What did he accept, and what did he quietly but firmly criticize? Jung's relationship with Eastern traditions was never dismissive, but it was never romantic either. He approached Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism with genuine respect, recognizing their extraordinary psychological sophistication. He saw in them refined descriptions of inner states, symbolic maps of consciousness, and methods for loosening rigid identification. In many ways, Jung believed these traditions articulated truths about the psyche that Western psychology had only begun to rediscover. At the same time, Jung was careful not to idealize them. His central concern was not with the traditions themselves, but with how they were adopted by Western minds. He observed that many people attempted to import Eastern concepts as ready-made solutions, without considering the psychological and cultural conditions that shaped them. Practices developed in societies with strong collective structures and symbolic continuity were being applied in contexts marked by individualism, fragmentation, and unresolved personal history. The results were often unstable. Jung's critique was subtle but firm. He believed that Eastern paths often assume a level of ego cohesion that many Western individuals have not yet achieved. When someone who has not confronted their personal unconscious tries to dissolve the ego, unresolved material does not vanish, it erupts. Trauma, shadow, and suppressed instinct demand attention. Jung warned that skipping this stage leads not to liberation, but to disorientation, inflation, or psychological splitting. This did not mean Jung rejected Eastern wisdom. Rather, he insisted on sequencing. One must first build a conscious relationship with one's own psyche before attempting to transcend it. Analysis, dream work, and engagement with personal history were not obstacles to spirituality, but prerequisites for it in the Western context. Without this grounding, spiritual language becomes a cover for avoidance rather than a vehicle for transformation. Jung's position ultimately emphasized responsibility over imitation. Eastern traditions could inspire, inform, and challenge Western consciousness, but they could not replace the work of individuation. Spiritual insight, if it is to be integrated, must pass through the personality rather than bypass it. And once this boundary is understood, a practical question emerges, not about belief or critique, but about application. How does one live spiritually without escaping the concrete demands of everyday life? After so much reflection on symbols, traditions, and inner dynamics, Jung always brought the conversation back to the ground of lived experience. For him, spirituality that does not alter the way a person lives day to day remains abstract. It may inspire, but it does not transform. The psyche is ultimately tested not in meditation halls or philosophical insight, but in how one handles responsibility, limitation, and relationship. Everyday life is where unconscious patterns reveal themselves most clearly. Jung observed that people often imagine spiritual growth as something separate from ordinary concerns: work, money, conflict, routine. Yet these are precisely the arenas where individuation unfolds. How someone reacts to authority, intimacy, failure, or boredom says far more about their level of integration than their vocabulary or beliefs. The unconscious does not care about ideals, it responds to behavior. When spiritual insight remains disconnected from daily action, inner division quietly deepens. What makes everyday life such a powerful psychological field is its resistance to illusion. One cannot permanently bypass frustration, dependency, or ethical choice. Patterns repeat, reactions resurface. Jung believed these repetitions are invitations rather than punishments. They point to unfinished integration, to parts of the psyche that have not yet been consciously related to. Spirituality, in this sense, becomes less about escaping repetition and more about learning from it. This perspective reframes discipline and commitment. Routine is no longer the enemy of awakening, but its container. Showing up, staying present, and tolerating discomfort without dramatization all cultivate psychological depth. Jung saw this capacity as a form of maturity, the ability to live symbolically without losing contact with reality. The sacred does not replace the ordinary, it inhabits it. When spirituality becomes grounded in daily life, It stops seeking extraordinary experiences and starts shaping ordinary perception. The ego relaxes its demand for significance, and meaning emerges through participation rather than elevation. This shift has implications beyond the individual. It alters how one relates to culture, crisis, and collective tension. And it leads naturally to a final reflection. Why does this integration matter so urgently now, in this particular moment of history? Jung would likely say that the current fascination with spirituality is not accidental. It emerges at moments when collective meaning begins to erode. Old structures lose credibility, shared narratives fragment, and individuals are left to construct identity without stable symbolic ground. In such conditions, the ego becomes overburdened. It is asked to generate purpose, direction, and certainty on its own. A task it was never designed to handle. Anxiety, confusion, and a diffuse sense of suffering follow naturally. What makes this moment unique is not the presence of crisis, but the speed at which it unfolds. Modern life leaves little room for digestion. Information arrives faster than understanding can form, and identity is constantly reshaped by external pressures. Jung believed that when consciousness cannot keep pace with experience, the unconscious compensates. Symptoms multiply. Polarization intensifies. Extremes become attractive because they promise clarity where nuance feels exhausting. In this environment, spiritual language becomes both a refuge and a risk. It offers meaning, but it can also become another ideology, another way for the ego to secure certainty without self-examination. Jung warned that when symbols are taken literally or used defensively, they lose their integrative function. Instead of unifying the psyche, they divide it further. The result is not awakening, but a more sophisticated form of confusion. This is why Jung's dialogue with Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism remains so relevant. These traditions do not offer solutions to the modern condition. They expose its psychological mechanics. They reveal how suffering arises from misidentification, imbalance, and premature transcendence. More importantly, they insist that transformation is a process, not an escape. Consciousness expands by including what was excluded, not by denying it. In a time obsessed with optimization, visibility, and instant resolution, this message is quietly radical. It suggests that the task is not to become extraordinary, but to become whole. Not to eliminate tension, but to carry it with awareness. Jung believed that when individuals undertake this work seriously, its effects ripple outward. Integration stabilizes perception. Responsibility replaces projection. And meaning emerges not from certainty, but from participation in life as it actually is. At this point, the journey turns inward again. All the ideas explored so far, ego, shadow, balance, totality, individuation, converge on a single question that cannot be answered abstractly. It must be lived, and it is this question that brings the exploration to its final threshold, where reflection gives way to responsibility. Phase 3. So here is the closing challenge. Suffering does not mean failure. It means something inside is asking to be integrated, and if you've ever felt that quiet pressure, the sense that you're doing everything right and still feeling off, this is your sign to stop chasing spiritual reassurance and start listening to what your life is actually revealing. Try one simple practice this week. Not a ritual, not a fantasy, just reality. Notice the moment you get triggered by criticism, rejection, silence, uncertainty, and instead of defending your identity, ask, what part of me is trying to stay in control right now? Then sit with the answer for a few breaths, long enough to feel it, not just think it. That's where the real work begins, and it's also where real freedom starts. And if you want this channel to keep guiding you through this kind of inner clarity, Jung, the shadow, Eastern traditions, and the psychology behind awakening, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next step isn't learning more ideas, it's learning how to live them, one honest moment at a time. Pause 4s.